If you're sympathetic to Christian nationalism, then you need to hear this. If you despise the idea of Christian nationalism, then you need to hear this. Join me as I talk to my personal friend, Yoram Hazony, the Israeli philosopher, who gives us some considerations from the Hebrew scriptures, the prophets, as to why we can't toss out the idea of nations and why it might be useful for thinking about who we are as Jews and even us as Christians. It's a fascinating talk. We're actually going to do a part 2 at some point because he's got so much more insight to give us. So stay tuned.
This is the Biblical Mind Podcast, produced by the Center for Hebraic Thought. Honest 5-star reviews help others find this podcast. Visit the magazine at thebiblicalmind.org for articles and videos that explore the deep structures of Scripture.
So what would be the thumbnail case for Christians if you were just to take them to their Bible and say, look, there's at least some obvious evidence that nations are a thing that God cares about? Where would be some touch points that you would take them in their Bibles?
Well, I think that the place to start is with the fact that that ancient Israel, through the writings of its prophets, self-describes as a nation, as a people. So we have to think about, what does that mean? But the fact that the story from Genesis through Kings, and then the great prophetic writings and scholarly writings after that, the fact that that Israel is not described as a faith; it's described as an which is a people, or a goy, which means a nation. Or Bnei Israel, the children of Israel, which is referring to Israel as an alliance of families who are who share a common descent, that they have converts, but in general, it's a nation or a people. And so the Old Testament gives us the framework for thinking about the history of the world, not in terms of cities, like the great Greek philosophers thought in terms of independent city-states, and not in terms of empires, because the Romans, for example, conceived of the entire world as being, in principle, something that should be under one scepter. And it's only in Hebrew scripture that Christianity inherits a view of the world as made up of nations, of families that group together as tribes, that group together as nations, and then also families of nations. And that structure gives you a very different kind of politics, because it assumes that your politics and ultimately your religion and your path to God are connected to your inherited traditions that are particular to your family, your tribe, and your nation. So that's definitely where you start. There's a lot more to be said, but that's where you start.
Yeah, I mean, what you're saying to me recalls my mind immediately to Genesis 10 and 11, the table of nations, as we call it, and then Babel, where you have kind of like this famous anti-empire, or it maybe a proto-anti-empire argument there. What do you think is going on in Genesis 10 with every family, clan, language, with that division of the earth in that way? Why do you think that's placed so prominently in the creation narrative?
Well, it's connected to the Babel story. Obviously, the issue is that at the beginning of Genesis, in fact, all through Genesis and maybe beyond, but at least in the beginning of Genesis, the way the story's written, it's God finding out stage after stage various unpleasant things about human beings who he's created. In the story of Noah, he gets so tired of it, he decides he's going to destroy the world. But But after Noah, the same pattern continues of God repeatedly discovering various characteristics of human beings that seemingly he hadn't planned for. And the particular human characteristic, like you can say that that it's a sin, but it's not clear if it's inherently sinful. The particular human characteristic that the Babel story focuses on is the desire, lasot lanu shem, to make a name for ourselves. Okay, and this urge of human beings to make a name for themselves in the Babel story is connected with this impulse to gather all of the nations under a single scepter. So you can read these passages two different ways, because there's a question of whether the division of the world into nations and languages, whether that happens before Babel or as a consequence of Babel. So there's two different ways to read it, but either way, if you read it the first way, then human beings dividing themselves into nations and languages is completely natural to human beings, and it's part of the way we're created. It's not 100% clear if the story's telling it, in such a way that you're supposed to think that God meant it in advance or not. But if you read it the first way, it's completely natural to human beings, and the sin of the Tower of Babel is to try to crush all of that by giving one language, one speech, and one set of ideas. One language and one way of seeing things because of one language. So the sin then is to try to crush out the diversity that is part of the natural order. And if you read it the other way, then what happens is that God looks at what happens when human beings try to enforce everybody being one language and one way of seeing things, and God finds it so revolting that he says that I'm changing reality in order to rejigger. Like from now on, human beings, they're going to be split into families and tribes and nations with their own languages and their own way of looking at things. Either reading brings you to a clear biblical reservation about the attempt to arrive at human uniformity. And people think that as the word diversity came into fashion, so like in the 1980s or something. But this whole issue is when you start by asking what are the political teachings and ramifications of the Bible and Hebrew Scripture. Right there at the beginning is the division into families, tribes, and nations, and it's clear that God prefers this diversity and is hostile to the attempt to wipe out diversity.
Yeah, that's a great point that I think I have argued in print, so I'll have to put my view out there that the first view is the best view, that diversity is there and that one group straggles over into Babel and creates problems there. But that I don't think most people look at these texts, especially Genesis 1 through 11, through the political lens. Now, you're a political philosopher. That's what your original training was. You've certainly escaped that mere moniker. But I don't think most people see, and I think this is maybe an American problem or maybe a liberal democracy problem, is we read about kings and kingdoms and tribes, and we just go, oh, isn't that cute? Like it's England over there or something. And we don't think of it as like, oh, no, this is their political philosophy. This is how they are thinking about the world, or it's certainly influencing their political philosophy.
When you said it's cute, I was thinking, oh, kings and tribes, it's the Lord of the Rings.
Right. Well, I mean, honestly, I think in American Christian culture, I think you get a bit of that, is there's a little bit of romanticizing and waxing on this. Yeah.
there is a deeper issue, which is that the Old Testament, as it is before you bring in the New Testament, the Old Testament, we've discussed this many times. The Old Testament, if you just read it itself for what it says, it's very preoccupied with this world. Right. I mean, it literally tells you the story of families combining into tribes, combining into a nation. They set up a kingdom, all about the attempts to make it better, the attempts to make it worse. It rises, it falls further, then exile, which is, entirely a political condition. And then the return from exile and the hope of restoration. It's political from beginning to end. Now, I'm not saying, obviously, that it's not about God, or that it's not about morals or personal faith or personal salvation. I don't mean to say that at all. But when you look at the New Testament, the balance shifts into a focus and a very strong emphasis on me and my relationship with God, me and how do I personally lead my life, and then what's my salvation personally, and
Well, I think that's a Christian interpretation of it. I'm not sure if the Jewish Jesus following sect would have said that, but yes, that is certainly a very popular.
Okay,
Christian
I didn't.
interpretation.
All right,
that is not an unfamiliar interpretation for most
look,
Christians.
As you know, I don't claim expertise in New Testament, so I'm perfectly happy to say that it's often read that way.
Yeah,
and these days when I travel around, I mean that's basically what I run into.
Sure. Yeah,
and so there's there's kind of like, where's your head at about reading the Bible? If you're open to it being a this worldly book or set of books, this worldly tradition, in addition, that is very, very preoccupied with political and public and communal issues. If you're open to that, then you can't avoid it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's in every chapter on every page. But I do think that reading that way is common and accepted among religious Jews, in a way that it's not right now among Christians.
Yeah,
and I think it's crucial for Christians to add that kind of reading to their repertoire, since the future of Christianity is tied up with the lives of nations.
Yeah. No, I think it's a very important point. And there is a lot of New Testament scholarship of the last generation that is focused on the political nature of the New Testament as well. I mean, Jesus doesn't say, I'm coming to set up a personal relationship with you, right? He talks mostly about the kingdom of God, which again, we hear the word kingdom and we think it's cute or religious-y or old-timey, but it's a political reality that he talks endlessly about, and what allegiance to the king and kingdom looks like. Which leads me to what would, I think, be an obvious question to anybody who's thinking about nationalism according to the Hebrew Bible is, that doesn't seem to have gone so well as a national project in the Hebrew Bible. So why would a reasonable person resource their thinking about nationalism and what a nation is and should be and can be from those texts, especially by the time you get to Kings, you're like, maybe this is a massive critique against some view of nationalism.
Well, look, for sure, you can't, if you're going to try to read biblical narrative as though, as though everything that happens is intended to teach us a positive lesson. Be like Jephthah,
right?
Be like Ahab. If you're going to try to read it that way, then you're not going to get anything. So, I mean, for sure, the the baseline for reading Hebrew scriptural narrative is look, this is the perspective of the prophets, and the perspective of the prophets is a critical perspective. I know people don't like that word these days, but I mean that it's not intended to accept worldly powers and leaders and rulers and the way people live as being something that is good most of the time. I mean, they are critical most of the time, but you are intended to come away from that criticism with an appreciation of what a good politics looks like. The fact that that only a third at most of the political leaders are positive in any way. It doesn't change the fact that it comes to teach us what a positive leader looks like. The crux of it is as we've discussed in the past, the crux of it is in the attempt of the Jewish people of Israel to live without a king, without a state. When we're talking in the Bible, we're talking about a king. We're talking about centralized government with a permanent standing army, with permanent forces that are capable of taxing the citizenry and supporting the big budget items of having a king and an army and a bureaucracy. And the scripture for sure has God beginning with the perspective that we don't need these things, that we can live in the old order of clans and tribes, where people are not taxed or they're rarely taxed. There is no central government. There's no king to rule over you, and in certain respects that is a biblical ideal. But on the other hand, the story doesn't go that way. The story has God embracing at the beginning of Samuel, embracing human kingship. He's definitely not happy about it, but he's not happy about lots of things that he ends up compromising with human beings about.
Yeah.
And there's no way to get around this. That Gideon and Samuel are, that they are representing an authentic view that's anti-king and anti-state, but God himself decides that the people are right and not Gideon and Samuel.
Yeah.
And that decision to accept a king, it gives you a subtle and complicated story, because God's embrace of the king and the state and centralized power it's never wholehearted, but still for most of 1,000 years, it's the it definitely is the way that the story is works out in the minds of the prophets is yes, human beings are corrupt and corruptible, corrupted, and they need some kind of human authority and not only divine authority in order to govern themselves. But you can't miss that teaching if you spend the time on these narratives. If you just skim it, then you might miss it.
Yeah, if you do what we call a children's church version of it, you can miss it very easily. And I think that's part of the problem. Is it is so subtle. The critiques are so subtle in some ways. I mean, some of them are blaring and obvious and repeated, but it's very sophisticated literature, as we've always argued. And that doesn't mean it's not available to normal people to read through it for themselves and kind of see what's going on in community. What you said about the kind of the critique but acceptance, it reminded me a bit of the prophets also critiqued very heavily the sacrificial system, the praise and the sacrifices of Israel. But I have argued against the idea that they were saying throw out the sacrificial system or throw out that whole system for Israel. but that they wanted to be trued up to the original intent, that justice and sacrifice would go hand in hand with one another. And I think I would guess that you would say what the nation could be with a human king also idealizes, or there's an idealized view here that justice and kingship and nationhood could go together as well in some not seamless but workable fashion. So what would you say are, the subtle critiques of nation and state that you see kind of strewn across the project? I mean, you could start in the Pentateuch if you wanted, but what are they worried about when it comes to leadership and statehood, like where it goes wrong, the pinch points, as it were?
Okay, just one last word about this issue of reading the critique as though it's throwing everything out. That ends with Noah. And that it's very important to, you have to read the narrative as a unified narrative. I know lots of academics don't like to do that, but it is constructed as one story by Jeremiah or whatever, whatever prophet we had at the end of this process. And the story raises at the beginning, in the early chapters of Genesis, it raises the possibility that that you should just throw out all the evils of human beings. And, God confronts this possibility of destroying the whole world. And he destroys it, and he starts again. And human beings continue to be sinful. I mean, his hand-picked, beloved Noah and his family, they're immediately, it turns out that they're sinners too. So the crucial background for every part of this story is to understand that it's told from the perspective of God has already decided that he's not going to destroy the world. He's not going to say, oh, you can't, you're so evil, you can't run a state. You're so evil, you can't do a temple service. You're so evil that, that your prophets are stealing words from one another. God's already decided in this narrative that the answer is not to just throw everybody out. And so everywhere you look, what you're getting is given the reality of sinful and corrupt human beings, given human nature, given what it's really like, how good can we make it within the constraints of what human beings just are? Okay, so then there's a number of basic critiques, and by the way, all of these biblical critiques end up being central to the Anglo-American political inheritance later. So let's begin with, we were going to talk a bit about the reissue of my book, The Virtue of Nationalism, which came out 7 years ago, and Basic Books just issued it in a second edition with all sorts of additions to it and revised. So the issue of nationalism comes out of the question of Babel, which is the question of the Assyrian Empire, the Babylonian Empire, the Egyptian Empire, the Persian Empire, the Alexander's Empire, and so on. It's always the same question. Human beings want to make a name for themselves. And the question is, if you're not going to uproot that, if you're not going to throw it away, and you're going to allow it to stay, okay, so it turns out that it's not just the Tower of Babel, but in the next chapter, in chapter 12 of Genesis, God tells Abraham, I'm going to make you a great name.
Right.
In other words, God is telling Abraham, I'm going to fulfill your longing, your natural human longing for a great name, but we're not going to do it in the way that the Tower of Babelites, the Babylonians, and so on, wanted to do it.
Yeah, the wordplay makes this kind of unmistakable because he even descends from the line of Shem, and then his.
It's like beating you over the head with it if you're willing to be open to seeing it. So that goes naturally with the prophets' hostility towards empire. In their eyes, look, in the eyes of emperors and these civilizations who built these empires, they stand for prosperity and peace. The god of the Assyrians sends them out onto the battlefield every single year for 300 years to conquer the four corners of the earth. Why? They say so, in order to end wars and bring prosperity and peace. It's kumbaya. The Assyrians, right?
To establish justice and righteousness in the land, right? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly right. And so, and the prophets look at this and they say, the Syrians are seeking to conquer the world in the name of justice and prosperity and peace, but in fact, they don't care how many people they slaughter. They don't care how many people they enslave. They don't care what they steal or what women they rape. I mean, if you ever, I mean, I don't know how many people in the audience have done this. If you just take like one of those sort of old books that describe the Assyrian Empire, it makes your hair stand on end.
Yeah.
I mean, it's in the name of these beautiful values, but in fact, it seems that the prophets were correct to see it as the most horrific kind of amoral tyranny. And so the first thing that I think that Christians and Jews learn politically from the Hebrew Bible is the idea of borders, which to us are often, at least older people think borders sound like a natural thing. In the Hebrew Bible, no, in the Hebrew Bible, there's borders everywhere.
Yeah.
God's giving, God keeps giving borders to the Jewish people over and over again, beginning in Deuteronomy.
Yeah.
Or you can even say beginning with Abraham.
I mean, even covenants are written on stones and placed at the borders, right? So even sacred documents.
So there's a really, really big emphasis on this idea that if you want to resist the extremely evil human inclination to try to conquer everybody else and tell them how to lead their lives and kill them if they don't want to do it, if you want to resist that, then the biblical formula is giving borders. God gives borders to all the nations. I mean, the first step to giving, to preventing your people from becoming like the Assyrians is to get them to understand that they're not allowed to take 1 inch of the land of their neighbors, which first appears at the beginning of Deuteronomy. That Moses warns the people that they won't be allowed to get an inch of the lands of Ammon and Esav, and that model where you say, look, let's give everybody their own space, and you live your way, you let other people find their own path to God, you worry about your path to God. That's very basic to the political, the Hebraic, the Jewish political teaching. Let's take a second.
Well, can I push back on that one? Because I think the natural problem that would arise in my mind is in Genesis 15, where you have God saying, look, the borders are from the river in Egypt to the great river Euphrates, right? So like it has this very expansive vision of the borders of Abraham's descendants. So how would you fit that in with this idea of restricted borders?
Well, the problem is that expansive it kind of depends on what generation you're looking at it. When living in the modern state of Israel, where Syria is a wholly different civilization, then of course it looks like wow, that's quite expansive. But I mean, the first thing you can say, if you want to, is that those borders are not the borders given to the tribes of Israel in the book of Joshua.
Right.
When they're conquering the land, Syria is excluded. So interesting question what's going on with this. But let's just take like sort of the broadest possible approach to this.
Okay.
The borders that go from the river of Egypt, which we don't know what that is,
Right.
but it's probably not the Nile. It's probably
There's something gets to the Wadi El Arish, I think, or
yeah, it's probably Wadi El Arish. Although you can make other arguments, but it's probably someplace not far from the current Israeli border in the Sinai Desert. But if you want to ask, like, why would any of the prophets talk about from Sinai to the from the border of the desert in Sinai to the Euphrates? What they're looking at, you can see. There's lots of places, but for example, in Isaiah, where he's sort of spreading out, he's giving you his future political vision,
right.
and he says, in that day, this is part of the, of the lambs are going to lie down with
right.
wolves, meaning that large, strong, viciously inclined nations will no longer go around eating all the smaller nations.
Mm.
And so the picture that Isaiah gives us is, he says, in that day Israel will be Shlishiyah, it'll be a third, together with Egypt and Assyria. And so his vision is that Egypt is incredibly powerful and Assyria is incredibly powerful, and Israel is small and weak and suffers from the aggression of both its neighbors. But his vision is that someday Israel will be able to live in peace with the Egyptians and the Assyrians. That's where you get that map from. It's obviously more complicated than this, because that's not the only map. If you're reading the Book of Kings, you see there the threat of the Egyptians from the south is incredibly clear, and the threat of the Babylonians from the north is very clear. And the in the time of Elijah, God doesn't send the Jews out to conquer Aram. It's interesting. Aram is, that's the people living roughly where Syria is. And instead of sending out the Jews to conquer Aram, God tells Elijah, what we really need is we need a better king in Aram who's going to be some kind of convert to Judaism. He's somebody that we met before, and he he comes to Samaria and he accepts the Jewish God. And so there's a slightly different vision where the dream of uniting the northern Jewish kingdom and the southern Jewish kingdom is like, it's off the table.
Right.
It doesn't look like it's even possible, much less conquering Syria. But what is possible is to try to create an alliance between Judah and Israel and Aram, to try to bring the three of them into being like a confederacy, like an alliance of God-fearing countries that together will be strong enough to resist Egypt and Babylonia. So in the end, after a couple of more centuries, it fails. But as a text teaching us about politics, it's a remarkable vision that says, look, you've got to work with what you've got. Like, of course, the ideal is that Israel and Judah should live under one king. That's obvious. And maybe the ideal is also that Aram should be part of that. But in reality, we don't have that. So in reality, the next best thing is a confederation. Let's try to put up godly kings in each of these three countries that together can meet the common enemy.
Yeah, it strikes me too that Isaiah, when you get to the very end of Isaiah, where he's really laying out a future political reign that is God enforced or God enhanced, or the new heavens, new earth, you get what Christians will be familiar with, this kind of idea of every tribe, every nation, every language. The nations are coming in, right? So there's this kind of acknowledgement that there are still different people who speak different languages, come from different cultures, and have different borders. But the beauty of the whole system is they're coming into Jerusalem now and acknowledging the one true God. And you have a very similar sentiment splattered across the New Testament text as well when they think forward to the new heavens and new earth.
And
Go ahead. Sorry.
It's also Old Testament. I mean, the vision of Solomon,
Right,
of Melchizedek, the King Solomon, the vision of the nations coming from the different parts of the earth in order to pay homage to the one God, the Jewish God, the universal God. That's right there in Kings and even earlier. But if you're looking at this politically, I mean, theologically is part of politically, but if you're looking at the political side of this, the idea of independent, Jewish independence, and various of the prophets also talk about the freedom of other peoples, of other nations, especially, the end of Jeremiah, that there's lengthy discussion that includes wishing for, at least a few other nations to regain their independence because they deserve it. That vision of political independence, which is, today we use the word nationalism, but that word, it just means it's political theory speak for a world of independent nations, for a world in which instead of one empire, or two or three big empires fighting over the world, you'll have many different nations, each one having its own freedom. That vision is intrinsic to the biblical politics, and I'm not sure that you can, find any authors who think differently.
Yeah, I think until you ask the tough political questions, like, do they actually think that the best thing that could have happened was that Egypt would become Jewish or something like that? Or did they believe that Egypt can do its thing? It would be great if Egypt acknowledged the one true God, the Almighty. That would make things better. But the goal isn't to imperialize Israel at this time, right? With looking forward to the new heavens, new earth, that's going to be the reality. God will be king.
Yeah.
We will all be subject.
Yeah, but does God being king have to mean that there's one universal empire?
Right.
I'm not at all sure. I mean, let's focus on another famous piece of Isaiah's vision is, in that day the nations will come from the ends of the
Right.
earth, and they'll say, let's go up to the house of Jacob and learn from his ways. But and that vision of the nations coming to learn from the Jews in Jerusalem, that's everywhere. I mean, the prophets argue about all sorts of things amongst themselves. They really don't agree. There's many things they don't agree about, but this they agree about. That versions of that vision are in Isaiah, in Ezekiel, in Jeremiah, in Micah, in Zechariah, and I mean it just over and over, this vision. The nations are going to come. They're going to say, "Let's go up," and they're going to come and learn in Jerusalem. Nowhere do those prophets say that Israel is going to go out and conquer them.
Right. Deuteronomy 4 also, you get the first version of this, right? That people are going to look at the law and say, what a wise and discerning people who has a God so near to them, right?
Yeah, and that's also an ideal. Like sometimes we get people looking at the Jews and saying, "What a wise and discerning
Right.
people." Sometimes you get quite the opposite.
Right.
But in terms of the vision that's being presented, is surprisingly consistent across many centuries and many different prophets, where there's a conscious resistance against the idea that conquest is the tool for converting the nations to the true God or to the truth generally or to the true way of life.
Yeah.
That's something that that in the Old Testament vision is we need to be good enough to make people want to come and learn from us. If we're not, then we're not doing our job. But we can't say, oh, they're not coming to learn from us, so let's go conquer Afghanistan.
Okay, I want to get a few more of these nodal ideas on the table that you think are subtle critiques going on here. So we got borders was the first one.
Yeah,
we did deep work with borders, so maybe we can do shallow work with some other ones.
Okay, so the idea of borders goes with the idea of national independence, meaning you don't have arbitrary borders. You have borders between nations,
Mm-hmm.
between nations that have their own traditions and their own internal mutual loyalties. And then there's the question of how are they supposed to govern themselves. And here there are many nodes, but the two most striking ones are the covenant at Sinai, where God, before the giving of the Ten Commandments, in chapter 19, you already have God sending Moses to make a covenant with the elders, and that covenant, that's where we get the expression that the Jews are going to agree to be Mamlechet Kohanim v'Goy Kadosh, a kingdom of priests and a holy people, and that frame explains what happens then when God gives the Ten Commandments. This is the instruction manual, but the frame is this nation is going to be a special nation. The implication is that other nations can also be special nations, but we're going to start here, and this nation is going to get laws that, as Yechezkel comments, laws that if a man should observe them, he will live by them, and this package of 10 precepts. We're obviously not going to go through all of them now, but you'll notice that this package, among the other things that it's built on the same kind of border drawing that we saw between nations.
Okay, so say more about that.
Well, internally, okay, so I mean, we've talked about if you're going to be a nation of priests, and the people want to come and learn from, so you're not going to go out and conquer the world, so you have to have borders. But internally, the model is very similar. That the model is every tribe gets a piece of land of its own. Okay, so that's not in the Ten Commandments, but within that, every individual has his own property, and you're not allowed to touch it. He has his own life, and you're not allowed to touch it. He has his own wife, and you're not allowed to touch her. And the whole thing is constructed like, it begins with like the big independence, and then it goes down to like tribal freedom, the tribes free from being oppressed by one another, and then it goes down to families and individuals who also have the same kind of freedoms that are granted by the law to be able to to govern your own your own garden and your own family the way you think, instead of having somebody else come and tell you what to do. Now, this is not libertarianism. It's not only about freedom. Right. Although this is the source. I mean, people who get carried away with this aspect of the biblical teaching, this really is the source for it. But the actual texts are much more balanced. You have a very complicated system of laws and morals, and the whole thing is kind of constructed as round after round of different kinds of checks and balances to ensure that each one has his own space.
Right.
And it also tells you what, if you're a decent person, what you're going to do in your own space. But as at the national level, so too at the family level, there's a teaching about what you should do with your own space. But the first teaching is this framework from the Ten Commandments, where the first thing you have to do is give space to others, and then within your own space, then there's lots of other restrictions and aspirational goals.
Yeah, I have a book on biblical law coming out in October, and getting to spend some time back in the biblical law, I think I was struck how much freedom, responsibility, and protections for various types of vulnerable people, and the wide vulnerable people was a much wider category than I originally suspected it was. There's a lot going on there, what it means to be this kind of people. I'd never put it together with the Ten Commandments, though. So thank you, thank you for that. It's you have this habit of saying things that once you say them, they seem so obvious. But
the question is, can it get into the book? Because if it's too late, then I didn't say it early enough. It's got to get into the book, Drew.
Oh yeah. So maybe I can ask you then one last question, because I think a lot of people are going to be hearing this and going like, yeah, okay, I'd never thought about that before. Wow, he's saying nationalism, which is a buzzword, a trigger for a lot of people. But this sounds so reasonable, and I hadn't thought about the biblical authors might have a perspective on this, and maybe I should take that more seriously. And but I'm sure a lot of people are thinking to themselves, well, what about this Christian nationalism we're experiencing in America? Or there's a British nationalist movement, not to be confused with the old nationalist movement, although there is some probably overlap. If I could get your hot take, which is not a hot take at all, but what's your hot take on maybe encouraging things in the Christian national movement to you, and then things that you're keeping an eye on, a little worried about?
Well, look, the thing about political movements is that they're almost always a mixed bag. And, this is kind of, I think that this is a very, very Jewish biblical kind of view of it. I have my political preferences, and they're well known, but I think that as a general matter, there's good people and there's crummy people that there's reasonable people and fanatics, unreasonable people in almost every kind of movement. And I think the nationalist Christianity in the United States is definitely of that kind. I've met in my in my work with nationalist conservative movements. Most of the people I meet are people who I admire and respect. I admire them as brave people who are standing to try to revive the independence of their various countries in the face of very, very aggressive, in my opinion, imperialist type of attempt to erase the borders between nations and have them be controlled from some center. So there's many people that I admire. I love them, like brothers, and there are also people who are rash and aggressive and sometimes quite ignorant, and they don't really care too much about whether they're ignorant or not. So I would say if people think that that Christian nationalism is inherently evil, I can't go with that. You can come to NatCon, to the National Conservatism Conference. The next one is in September in Washington, and you'll meet a lot of people who are Christian and concerned for the independence of their nation, and they're lovely and they're smart, and I just love them. You've been to one of these?
I have not.
I don't know what you've never come.
I've never come.
Sure?
Yeah.
Oh, well, maybe
Yeah,
it's time to do like field
maybe
research.
I should actually show up to one of these and hear it out a little
Yeah,
bit more.
field research. But the look, the key to the thing is to stay away from uh, buying the propaganda that somebody wants to say uh, nationalism is evil. All nationalists are evil. Therefore, Christian nationalists are doubly evil. I mean, there's all this going around,
Hmm.
and it's it it doesn't reflect the reality of nationalist Christians in America or in other Western countries. Um, they are many of them are really something special and worth getting to know them. Whether you agree with them or not.
Yeah, that's good encouragement. And one last question, and this is it's completely subjective on your part, but how many of these people, because you know almost everybody who's a mover, I mean, you're almost a founder of this movement. Um, how many of these people do you think have a deeply resourced biblical view of their nationalism? By biblical, I mean all scripture of their Christian nationalism. And how many of them are just kind of firing off general theological cliches or ideas that they think sound Christian-ish?
Well, um, you know, I definitely don't want to get into business of telling Christians you know, who's correct
Right.
theologically. I think I'll leave that to you all. But I think there's a very sharp generational
Hmm.
divide when you look at people who are in their 50s, 60s, and 70s, and this is across Christian denominations. I includes not only we get Baptists and Presbyterians and Anglicans. We also have Catholics and Eastern
Right.
Orthodox. As a generalization, people in their 50s, 60s, and 70s um, tend to know quite a lot about Scripture, and they tend to know quite a lot about the Old Testament. Some of them are extremely fluent in Old Testament, to the extent that they're they're very good scholars,
Hmm.
and it's very impressive. When you get to the newer generations, I would say the break point is like age 45. Basically, everybody under age 45 almost. I mean, there's some rare exceptions, but overwhelmingly people who consider themselves serious, devout, and learned Christians, who are looking. You've used the word resourcement a couple of times. So the people who talk about that, who are talking about this, you know, back to Scripture and back to the early reformers and back to knowledge. Um, if you're talking about people under 45, and many of the most impressive people are younger, they're under 45. I would say that their knowledge of Hebrew Bible, of Old Testament, is surprisingly weak.
Hmm.
I mean, it's very complicated. Like, why is that happening, and how is it
Yeah.
happening? But just to give you a sense of it, there's plenty of intellectuals on the Christian right, the nationalist Christian intellectuals, who they really are. They're genuine intellectuals, but they are trying to build Christian political thought from the New Testament overwhelmingly,
Hmm.
and from Aristotle,
Hmm.
and various other substitutes. But it's very, very common that they're thinking about, they've created what to me is this very strange contraption, which um, looks mostly to the New Testament for sort of like the biggest picture salvation story and basic morals, but then it turns to pagan sources for political thought,
Yeah.
and I don't think it comes out right at
Yeah.
all. But it's it's a very, very powerful impulse right now.
Yeah. Um, Not unusual in other spheres of intellectualism as well. Yoram Hazony, thank you so much for taking the time. And I think we want to do a part 2 if you have the time where we can actually talk. Oh, yeah, absolutely. We can talk more about nationalism and these ideas, because I think we just barely scraped the surface. The book is called The Virtue of Nationalism, an expanded edition with some new insights in there and some answers to critics. Thank you for your wisdom, Yoram.
God bless you, Dru. So see you soon.
You've been listening to the Biblical Mind podcast, exploring the deep structures of Christian scripture. For more, visit the magazine at thebiblicalmind.org. Subscribe to this podcast at all the usual places so you never miss an episode.